When affirmative action was white. An Untold History of Racial Inequality in 20th-Century America. By Ira Katz Nelson. Preface. Du Bois's Paradox. No more critical situation ever faced the Negroes of America than that of today, not in 1830, nor in 1861, nor in 1867. More than ever the appeal of the Negro for elementary justice falls on deaf ears. 3/4 of us are disenfranchised, yet no writer on democratic reform says a word about Negroes. When I chanced upon these sentences in an essay by W.E.B. Du Bois, I was astonished to learn it had been written in 1935, a time of great achievement for President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. That year, the President and Congress looked beyond the nation's economic desolation and hoped to find more than temporary measures to relieve mass hardship. Joining forces, they created Social Security and assured workers they could band together in industrial unions. More broadly, they sought to demonstrate that the globe's leading democracy could fashion an alternative to the appeal of Soviet and German dictatorships. These new initiatives coincided with a historic political shift, in which a majority of Black Americans had begun to turn away from Lincoln's Republican Party to offer their votes, when they could vote, to Roosevelt's Democratic Party, despite the presence within the New Deal coalition of Southern Democrats who fiercely protected Jim Crow. Keenly aware that this shift hardly was ideal, Du Bois was in no mood to celebrate. Black America, he understood, was mired in difficulty despite any bounty offered by the New Deal. Negro children are systematically denied education. When the National Education Association asks for federal aid to education, it permits discrimination to be perpetuated by the present local authorities. Once or twice a month Negroes convicted of no crime are openly and publicly lynched, and even burned. Yet a national crime convention is brought to perfunctory and unwilling notice of this only by mass picketing and all but illegal agitation. When a man with every qualification is refused a position simply because his great-grandfather was black, there is not a ripple of comment or protest. The contrast between the extraordinary policy advances of 1935 and Du Bois's mordant appraisal of the pervasiveness of racism at the height of the New Deal unsettled my conventional understanding. I soon launched a research program to ask how the achievements of Presidents Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman had been shaped by the pivotal role Southern Democrats still were able to play as guardians of racial segregation. I also set out to identify the consequences of these ties between social and racial policy on American politics and society today. When affirmative action was white, is one result of this endeavor. It reveals how policy decisions dealing with welfare, work, and war during Jim Crow's last hurrah in the 1930s and 1940s excluded, or differentially treated, the vast majority of African Americans. It also traces how inequality, in fact, increased at the insistence of Southern representatives in Congress, while their other congressional colleagues were complicit. As a result of the legislation they passed, blacks became even more significantly disadvantaged when a modern American middle class was fashioned during and after the Second World War. Public policy, including affirmative action, has insufficiently taken this troubling legacy into account. My goal in developing these arguments and proposing guidelines for new policies is not to write yet another history or analysis of affirmative action. The number of articles and books on this subject is considerable. Policy historians have taught us how the origins of affirmative action as federal public policy in the 1960s and 1970s were byproducts of other intentions. For more than 3 decades, justices of the Supreme Court have gauged the legal status of affirmative action. Many scholarly and popular onlookers have disputed how affirmative action has shaped our schools, workplaces, and government, civil and military. Advocates and detractors have developed powerful arguments about key moral, constitutional, and practical issues. These, by now, are familiar. I remark on these conflicting understandings and patterns, but this commentary neither is my main theme nor my central purpose. Writing as a historian, I want to set the record straight. As a political scientist, I would like to understand the mechanisms that produce these outcomes. As a citizen, I wish to present these understandings in order to alter our misconceptions and reposition the direction of how we think, talk, and act about affirmative action. Rather than limit attention to successful programs that have made our elite institutions more racially integrated, I propose that affirmative action focus on antidotes to specific harms that date back to national policies in the 1930s and 1940s as remedies for the deep, even chronic dispossession that continues to afflict a large percentage of Black America. Above all, I want to shift our focus in three primary ways. The first alteration I propose is a change in our historical attention span. Discussions about affirmative action, whether historical, philosophical, sociological, economic, or political, usually begin with events and debates that took place 4, rather than 7, decades ago. This I believe to be a mistake, albeit one easy to understand. After all, the language of affirmative action as well as explicit policies carrying that name only were launched in the 1960s. By contrast, I look back as well as forward from the vantage of the mid-1960s. As a result, a mainly neglected earlier history of race and public policy comes into view, allowing us to see, think, and act about affirmative action in fresh ways. The second modification intends to broaden our understanding of these issues. Today, when we say the words affirmative action, we almost always think about higher education and top-tier jobs. Recently, I conducted a quick keyword electronic search to classify stories about affirmative action in some of the country's leading newspapers: Atlanta Journal-Constitution, New York Times, Washington Post, USA Today, news magazines, Newsweek, Time, U.S. News & World Report, and the Black Press, New York Amsterdam News, Chicago Defender. In each case, education and college vastly surpass any other category. Only jobs and employment are also present in significant numbers. By contrast, the words poverty, inequality, and social justice show up in the media with far less regularity. By linking the history of affirmative action for blacks since the mid-1960s with the prior record of affirmative action for whites, I hope to refocus public debate on these neglected subjects. A third shift in this book is placing affirmative action on more secure ground by binding New Deal and Fair Deal history to an argument about when, why, and how history should loomed in crafting public policies today. I first encountered affirmative action as a young assistant professor. In 1971 I served as the junior faculty representative at Columbia University on a political science search committee. The Department of Labor threatened the university with the loss of $13 million in federal funding unless it hired more women and minorities. Not fair, said my colleagues, who resisted by proposing the appointments of 5 white men. Struck by the fierceness of opposition to what manifestly seemed fair to me, together with the Department of English, political science had functioned for years as a relatively closed gentleman's club for white Protestants. I was distressed by the absence of good grounds for a rejoinder to the senior members of my department, who deployed high-minded talk about color blindness and merit to reinforce a historical pattern of exclusion. Ever since, I have been troubled by the inability of advocates of affirmative action to secure their ground and by the narrowness of the policies they have defended. To be sure, a persuasive case has been mounted in favor of diversity in middle and higher management in law firms, in higher education, and in primary and secondary classrooms, police forces, and firefighting companies whose members interact directly with the heterogeneous public. But this type of defense has inadequately shown why remedies for harms based on race should be deployed. Defenders tend either to make very general claims for compensatory policies without clarifying how affirmative action should perform acts of restoration, or they retreat to pragmatic statements to argue that corporations and universities would be more vulnerable to anti-discrimination lawsuits without such policies in place. Those of us who think the work of affirmative action is incomplete need to bolster our case. Set against the principled opposition to affirmative action, both lines of reasoning are inadequate. Instead, I follow a more historical path that connects remedies to very particular public harms, and I try to explain why this approach is persuasive in both analytical and practical terms. When affirmative action was white, in short, is an attempt to affect the ways we consider this vexing subject. Today, the once contentious colorblind standard of non-discrimination is broadly accepted. So, too, are efforts at outreach and recruitment aimed at increasing the number of applicants for scarce positions in schools and firms. Where agreement stops is where compensatory discrimination starts, that is, where minority individuals are chosen even if white applicants have more appropriate qualifications judged by customary measures like grades and test scores. The controversy over affirmative action, Randall Kennedy rightly noted in 1986, constitutes the most salient current battlefront in the ongoing struggle over the status of the Negro in American life. The question still bites. As American troops were being dispatched to Iraq early in 2003, Robert Bartley observed in his Wall Street Journal column that second only to the pending war, affirmative action is the issue of the day. Unresolved and unsatisfactory, debate seems almost endless between advocates of reparations and defenders of non-discrimination and equal treatment who often seem blind to the organizing power of race in American life. In effect, broad and often unfocused claims for restoration have competed with anti-racist principles that direct us to racial neutrality. As a result, these disagreements by politicians, activists, philosophers, and jurists tend to yield the high ground to opponents of affirmative action, who claim such policies are wrong because, however well-intentioned, they remain trapped within racist assumptions. Like many others, I have been unhappy with these choices. Hoping to move beyond options that downplay racism or reinforce racial divisions, this book offers an alternative, one that plaits history and principle together, as in a braid. Finally, a word about my subtitle. In what sense is this polemical book an untold history? Although many features of my story have been discussed and analyzed by an array of talented social scientists and historians, the various strands in these excellent studies have not been brought together sufficiently. This is regrettable because the wide array of literature from which I draw invites just such an effort. From Robert Lieberman, we know how Social Security left out maids and farm workers and how the Landmark Law of 1935 distinguished between social insurance for old age and more constricted, less centralized instruments of social assistance. From Jill Quadigno, we learn about the racial sources and implications of modern social policy. From Michael Brown, we discern the tight set of linkages that connected race and fiscal imperatives to the power of the Southern wing of the Democratic Party when the modern American welfare state was shaped. From Suzanne Mettler, we are taught how even apparently universalistic public policies can divide categories of citizens from each other. From Neil Foley, we understand the impact of mid-century social policy on racial groups in the Cotton Culture South. From Elizabeth Cohen, we experience how, even in the North, the treatment of veterans after the Second World War was significantly differentiated by race. From Daniel Kreider, we comprehend the powerful impact race had on the nation during the global war. From Desmond King, we perceive the role that the federal government played from the 1910s to the early 1950s to secure racial segregation. From Nancy Weiss, we witness how torn Black Americans were by the bounty and constraints the New Deal presented. And from William Julius Wilson, we grasp the economic, social, spatial, and political mechanisms that have divided Black America between a growing but minority middle class and a far less fortunate and a good deal more marginal African American majority. My debt to these exceptional colleagues and to this outstanding body of scholarship is substantial. This book simply could not have been written without these and many other excellent works, some dating back to the New Deal and Fair Deal, which have provided me with guideposts, evidence, ideas, and illumination. Notwithstanding, my subtitle holds. Despite the work of leading scholars, the American public remains in the dark about the moment not very long ago when affirmative action was white. I mean untold history in the sense of a not fully conveyed or altogether disclosed story, one that comes into full view only when its parts are considered together. The various elements of mid-20th century public policy that advantaged whites have been thought about, in the main, one at a time rather than in a single, if complex, configuration. Moreover, these histories, even when thought to be germane to current issues, have only been loosely connected to present reflections and disputes. Instead, my basic themes, how the cumulative and diverse public policies of the federal government during the 1930s and 1940s shaped affirmative action for whites primarily under the aegis of the South and Congress, and why this history matters for present-day efforts to create a less racially unjust country, have been organized to make two kinds of connections, among a range of policies in the past that usually are considered separately, and between the constellation of initiatives then and the possibilities for a new type of affirmative action now. That is what I have tried to accomplish, all the while motivated by the historical puzzles and goals enunciated in the address President Lyndon Johnson delivered to graduates and their families at Howard University in June 1965. It was called to fulfill these rights. 4 decades later, the challenge confronts us still.